Shalom Aleichem, everybody. We're continuing with our series of virtual Divrei Torah. I'd like to start off by wishing all those in need of refuah shlema should have refuah shlema b'karov, and all those in need of a nechama, of a consolation, should have a consolation. This week we start off a new sefer, the book of Devarim, the Sefer Devarim, and of course Parshas Devarim, which is always the parsha read the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, read in the middle of the period that we know as the 9 days. And the question is, what is the connection? We know there's always a connection between the parsha and the Jewish calendar, the time of year that the parsha is read in. Nothing is by coincidence. So what is the connection, or what are the connections between the parsha of Devarim and the time of year that we currently find ourselves in, of the 9 days? So the most obvious connection is the episode of the spies. We know the first Tisha B'Av, the first tragedy, if you will, to occur on the 9th of Av in our history was with the spies, the 12 spies. 10 out of the 12 spies came back with a negative report. 2 of the 12, Yoshua and Caleb, came back with a positive report about the land. But the Jews, basically, most of the people went with the negative report of the 10, and they cried. The spies came back on the 8th of Av, and that night, the night of the 9th of Av, the people cried in their tent, and God, our rabbis tell us, said, I told you the land is good, and that you're going to be able to conquer it. You have nothing to fear. You're crying for no reason. In the future, unfortunately, on this night, I'm going to give you something to cry about. And of course, we know for the rest, at least until the redemption, this night and day, the calendar date of the 9th of Av, has been perhaps the most difficult date in the Jewish calendar. Many tragedies occurred, of course, including the destruction of the first and second Batei Migdash, the first and second temples. So this was the first Tisha B'Av in history, was the episode of the spies, and Moshe Rabbeinu in Parshas Devarim, in fact, the whole book of Devarim, he's really recapping the past 40 years of the Jews' sojourn together with him in the desert. And in this week's Parsha, he recaps and focuses on the whole episode of the spies. So clearly that's an obvious connection between the time of year which we find ourselves in right now, leading up to Tisha B'Av, and the Parsha of the week. And specifically, there's Moshe Rabbeinu starts off the whole recounting of the episode. He says, "Vatikruvuna ilai kulchem." By the way, it's interesting to note, there's some details in this recounting over here in Parshas Devarim that are not mentioned in the original episode, if you will, in Parshas Bamidbar, in Sefer Bamidbar, and Parshas Shlach Lecha, where the episode actually, quote unquote, happens, where it's told over in the initially. So one of the details that's added in is that Moshe Rabbeinu says, "Vatikruvun elai kulchem," that all of you approached me with a request to send spies. In other words, in Parsha Shlach Lecha, that request of the people is not mentioned. It just says Hashem says to Moshe, "Shlach Lecha Nashim," send spies. But the request of the Jewish people, which precipitated that, is not mentioned over there, but it is filled in over here. And again, the phrase used is "Vatikruvun elai kulchem." All of you approached me. And Rashi, in the name of Chazal, takes note of the use of the phrase "Vatikruvun elai kulchem." All of you approached me. Rashi says "Birvuvya." Everyone, it was like a mob, basically, all mixed together, a disordered mob. It was Canaan. The elders were cutting ahead of the community leaders, and the children were cutting ahead of the elders. Everyone pushing each other. It was a disorganized, disrespectful, chaotic scene when they approached Moshe to ask that they send a spy mission before actually attempting to conquer the land, as opposed to Rashi and Chazal say when the Jewish people approached Moshe after the giving of the 10 Commandments, and they said to Moshe, that was such an awesome experience. It was too awesome. It was too overwhelming for us that we heard God speak directly to us. How about you speak to God, or God will speak to you, and then you, Moshe, relay all the information and the commandments to us. It's too much for us to hear God directly. So in that request, the pasuk says, "Vatikruvun elai Kol Roshei Shiftechem V'Ziknechem. It says all, not all of you, but rather the heads of your tribes and your elders approach me. In other words, there's a demarcation and a delineation of, in other words, that the leaders of the community were allowed to go first, and then the older people. In other words, it was not a chaotic scene. It was each group giving proper deference and preference to the more senior and more respected group. It was a very orderly procession. And so Moshe says that request was a proper request. In other words, it was legitimate, that you were too overawed by God's direct communication, that you wanted me to be kind of the intermediary, if you were. God will teach me and I'll teach you. That request was hogenos, was proper, and it was done in a proper way. The fact that the request was a legitimate and proper request was reflected in the manner and the orderly manner in which the people approached Moshe. Everyone not pushing and shoving, the heads of the community going first, followed by the older people, and followed by the youth. Everything was orderly, and the request was an appropriate request. As opposed to over here, Moshe Rabbeinu says it was Vatikrivun elai kulchem, all of you. Berevuvia, Rashi says, and Chazal say it was all a chaotic mob scene. Everyone's pushing each other, no one giving proper kavod to the ones who should go first. It was a chaotic scene. So I think you see here a very important lesson. Sometimes, we can't tell if a request or a desire on behalf of a community is a proper request. In other words, is it going to end well? Is it not going to end well? Is it motivated l'shem shamayim? Is it not motivated l'shem shamayim? So sometimes that's unclear. But what Rashi and Chazal are telling us here is one way to figure it out is to look at the way the request is made. If the way that it's done, if the process through which something is done in an appropriate fashion, okay, so that's very often indicative that the very mission or the very request itself is a worthwhile request. It's done for the motivation is proper, and it's a l'shem shamayim request, and it's a l'shem shamayim mission. Okay, as was the case when the Jews asked Moshe, God will tell you, and you teach us. Is too overwhelming for God to speak with us directly, and the propriety of the request was reflected in the manner in which the request was made. Everybody was orderly, and it was done with a proper kavod and derech eretz and in a menschlich fashion. However, as we know, the spies, in other words, Moshe went along with it, kind of was hoping it would turn out okay. But obviously it turned out to be a disaster, and we see really an early indication that it really wasn't a proper request, even though it sounded legitimate. It sounded, we just want to check out the land. We want some intelligence reports to make it easier for us to conquer militarily, etc. It sounded like a neutral or a legitimate request, but we have an indication if something is not done in the proper fashion, something is done in a non-menschlich fashion, so that's already an indication. Even though the request sounds legitimate on the surface, but that's already an indication that something is amiss here. And the fact that the very request was made b'irvuvia, v'atikrivun elai kulchem, it was done in a non-orderly fashion where people were pushing and shoving, and the people were not giving derech eretz to the community leaders and to the elders. That already indicates the fact that it was done in such a chaotic fashion indicates that something was already amiss, even though on the surface the process seemed legitimate. But if it was done really in an inappropriate fashion, that indicates that really at its core, it was not done l'shem shamayim. So that's a very important lesson to learn from the way the people approached Moshe Rabbeinu in this whole episode of the spies, that we could often tell the legitimacy and the propriety of a communal endeavor by the way it's done. If it's done in the right way, with the proper derech eretz given to the proper people, so then we could see that it bears fruit and it has a successful outcome. But if it's done in a non-menschlich way, then that's already indicative. Although on the surface it sounds legitimate, it's already indicative of the fact that something is amiss. Very, very important lesson that we learn from the spies. Another connection. Not as obvious, but there's many connections between the parsha and the 9 days and Tisha B'Av and the 3 weeks the period in which we find ourselves in is the very beginning of the parsha, and the name of the parsha is Devarim, and the name of the sefer is Devarim. It says Eila Devarim Asher Dibra Moshe Kol Yisrael. These are the words. This whole book of Devarim, of Deuteronomy, represents the final 36 days of Moshe Rabbeinu's life, in which he's recapping his sojourn and his journeys with the Jewish people over the past 40 years. And that, this final speech obviously was more than once, it was kind of an elongated session, if you will. Like the Torah itself says, it started on the first day of the 11th month, which is Rosh Chodesh Shvat, and we know our tradition tells us that Moshe Rabbeinu passed away in Zion Adar, so it was a sum total of 36 days. But these words are the words of the final speech of Moshe Rabbeinu to the Jewish people. So the word for in Hebrew for words or word is davar. And it's actually some commentaries. I actually heard this idea from my brother Sadia Shmuel, who should be well. Some commentaries connect the word davar to dvora, which means be. And what's the connection between dibur and davar, speech and words, and a bee, and a dvora? With dvora, the word, it's a woman's name. It's also, the famous prophetess Deborah, but the word itself actually means bee. What's the connection between words and a bee? So the commentaries explain that just like a bee, basically, a bee on the one hand produces something very sweet, i.e. honey, but a bee could also sting. So too words are like a bee. Words could be used in one of two fashions, in one of two ways. They could either be used to sting and hurt and be hurtful and destructive, God forbid, or they could be sweet and encouraging and uplifting and things that are a vehicle for construction and uplift. So words are like a bee. It could either be sweet like honey or it could be sting like a bee. So that's a very important lesson that relative and relevant to the time period which we find ourselves in right now. We know we're in the period of the 3 weeks. We call it the 3 weeks, but it's actually, if you look at the calendar, from the 17th of Tammuz when the 3 weeks starts till the 9th of Av, which finishes that period, it's not actually 21 days, but it's actually 22 days because you're including both the 17th of Tammuz and the 9th of Av. You count it up, right? Tammuz is 29 days, so 17 through 29 is 13 days, plus 9 days in Av. 13 plus 9 is 22 days. Now, we know in Judaism, what does the number 22 represent? There are 22 letters in the Hebrew alphabet, Aleph through Taf. There's Chaf Beis Osios, there's 22 letters. So that's indicative of the fact that words and speech, and the letters, obviously, which make up words, play a primary role in this time of year. In other words, part of the avoda of the 22 days of the quote unquote 3 weeks is to be masakin, is to fix our use of our words, of our dvarim, of the Chaf Beis Osios, of the 22 letters which make up our speech. Because, as we know, as our rabbis tell us, the second temple was destroyed because of sinas chinam, of baseless hatred and fighting and divisiveness amongst the Jewish people. And obviously a major part of that is lashon hara, evil speech, bad speech, hurtful speech, destructive speech. That plays, it's become, part of the way people spend their time on Tisha B'Av is to listen to the Chavetz Chaim Heritage Foundation, videos. They're nice videos, but in other words, what are a lot of these teachers talking about is the importance of shmiras halashon, of guarding one's tongue and using one's lashon and dibur and dvarim in a constructive fashion. So that's a key facet that we have to work on during this period of the 22 days of the quote-unquote 3 weeks. And that's another connection between the parsha and the time period which we find ourselves in. It's a time of Eila HaDvarim. These are the words. In other words, it's a time period where we have to masakin our dvarim, our speech, our words, and be like the positive side of the dvorah. We have to use our words to heal and to give encouragement and use our speech for Torah study and words of prayer and in other words, what God created our speech for. In other words, that is what, in fact, man is called a midaber, as we've mentioned on other occasions. Jewish philosophers break up all forms of existence into 4 general categories. There is domain, which is the inanimate mineral life, and then there's someach, the vegetative life, vegetation, plants, trees, grass, etc. There's behemoths, the animal kingdom, and then there's humankind. How do they refer to humankind? As a midabrim, as a midaber. Human is a midaber in their categorization, one who speaks. In other words, speech is life and death is in the hands of the tongue, of the speech. In other words, speech is man's most godly gift. In fact, famously, as we've also mentioned on another occasion, it says in Bereshis, Vayipach, Ba'apav Nishmas Chayim, and man, God blew the breath of life into man, and Vayi Adam Lenefesh Chayim, man became a living being when God breathed his godly breath in the soul of man into man. Man became a living being. How does Targum Onkelos translate Vayi Adam Lenefesh Chayim? Man became a living being. It says it became the Ruach Mamala, a talking being. In other words, that is the most significant power, as we mentioned, the most unique feature of man, above, beyond, and beyond the beast. Beasts also communicate to a certain degree. Obviously, they make noises and the like, and they have some kind of level of communication. But the power of intelligent speech is unique to man, and that is man's most unique gift. In fact, that is how God Himself created and creates the world. Basara ma'amaros nivra olam. The world was created with 10 utterances, with 10 sayings. God created the world with speech, and man is created in God's image. He's created b'tselem Elokim. So man also creates with his speech, but also, unfortunately, man can destroy with his speech. So our power of speech is our most important power and most important faculty, and it's how we use it which makes all the difference. The lesson that we're supposed to take from this time of year, these 22 days, and from the Parsha of Devarim, and in fact the spies, what was their sin? It was actually Hotziu Dibas Haaretz Ra'ah. They spoke Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. So the whole sin of the original ninth of Av was also because of Dibur, with a misuse of speech. They slandered and spoke ill of Eretz Yisrael. They spoke Lashon Hara about Eretz Yisrael. So the whole tikkun of this time period is through Dibur, is through speech. And in Mirza Hashem, through Misakin, our Dvarim, to use our words to be like Dvash, to be honey, to be sweet, to be constructive, to be productive, to use our speech for prayer and Torah study and words of encouragement, Be'ezras Hashem, with that, and of course avoiding, there's a double point here, Sur Me'irav Aseito, we have to avoid, it's not enough just to use our positively. Well, listen, if we take up all our time positively, we won't have time to sin. But in other words, we have to avoid the ra. In other words, not use it, no beast things, no negative or harmful speech, no lashon hara, and use it for honey, for constructive things. And Mirza Hashem, b'schus that, this time period will be transformed like it was meant to be originally. If the Jews had not sinned with the sin of the spies, this would be the time period of the year when they would have entered Eretz Yisrael. Would be a great celebratory time period. So Mirza Hashem, our rabbis tell us, and the Nevi'im tell us, that if we're misaken what we're supposed to misaken, if we fix what we're supposed to fix during this time of year, not only will it cease to be a mournful time, but it'll actually be transformed. The true potential will be revealed, which is a time of ultimate celebration. That all the Yomim Tovim, that all the Tinios, right, as the Navi Zechariah says, Tzom HaRavi, Tzom HaChamishi, Tzom HaShvi, Tzom HaAsiri, the fast of the fourth month of the month, Tammuz being the fourth month, the fast of the fifth month, the month of Av, of course, that's the fast of Tisha B'Av, the fast of the seventh month, Tzom Gedalia, which is Tishrei, and the fast of the 10th month, which is Teves, Asar B'Teves, all these fast days which commemorate tragedies and the destruction of the temple. Yula Beis Yisrael will be for the house of Israel, l'sason l'simcha, for joy and happiness. May we be zocha that through our work, through our shmiras halashon, through our use of speech in a positive, constructive fashion, will be zocha to see that transformation. And Mirza Hashem, this year already, will be zocha for binyan Beis Hamikdash, Meherav Yameinu. Amen. Have a great Shabbos.